Welcome to the North Tonawanda Football Hall of Fame YouTube channel. My name is Ed Helinski. We've got another great guest here today. You recognize him from his days on WKBW, the Empire Sports Network. Probably listened to him on WNSA. Has his own media company. He's still going at it strong as always. The one and the only Bob Koshinski. Bob, good to meet you. Good to catch up with you.
Great being with you today, Ed. Two handsome Polish boys spending some time together.
Oh, the Bobchies would love us. You know that? No doubt about that.
Absolutely.
1972 Niagara Wheatfield graduate. Got to ask you about your football career. You're probably into wrestling as well too. Your coach obviously was Armand Cacciatore. Let's start with that. Tell me about your high school career.
Well, there wasn't much to speak of initially. I went out as a freshman. I was the smallest kid on the team, and I was on the fifth squad, if you can imagine. That's how many kids were on the freshman team. And I was the very last running back. I was all of 5 foot tall. And my debut as a freshman, Coach Paul Scaletta sent me into the game to call timeout. I got into the huddle. I told the quarterback, call timeout. Scaletta came out to the field, said, Koshinski, you're back on the sidelines. That was it. I didn't even stay in for a play. And then my sophomore year, again, still small. I made up for my height with, being slow. So it was a double whammy. I just got in a little bit as a sophomore, as a junior on the varsity. I saw no playing time, got hurt about 3/4 of the way through the season. And then as a senior, I had spent most of my summer up at Long Beach, Canada, on the beach with my buddies. My relatives all had cottages up there. So all day I spent running through the sand, playing football in the sand, just having a great time. And I really asked myself, why do I want to go out for football my senior year and waste another, 4 months? And one day I was trimming my dad's lawn, and who pulls up in front of my house but Armand Cacciatore. Now, Armand had been my wrestling coach as well. And I knew Armand from 7th grade, going out for then what they called intramural wrestling. And he had heard that I wasn't coming out for the team. And he asked me to get in his car, and he drove around and he gave me a pep talk about how you can't quit. You just can't quit. You have to persevere. You have to stay with whatever it is you've committed to. And by the end of the drive, I committed to going out for the team. And I'm glad I did, because I got to play as a senior. It was about the 5th game of the year that I earned a starting position. And the first game I played was against the old Trot Vocational High School. And it was a real lopsided game. We won 59-0, and I scored the first 2 touchdowns of the game. And I got my picture in the Niagara Gazette. So all was well with the world. And I always go back to that pep talk Coach Cacciatore gave me, because I've never quit anything since. And I'm glad that he convinced me to go out. So that was my brief high school football career. And wrestling, I had a little bit more success. I was a class AA champ, and lost to the kid who went to the States by just a single point. So, Armand built a real wrestling dynasty out there. And ironically, after my junior year, he retired as the wrestling coach the first time. I always kid Armand that he's retired more times than Frank Sinatra, but he retired as the wrestling coach to dedicate his time fully to football. I was on his very first football team in 1970. And we were like the Bad News Bears. Armand hadn't quite figured out the intricacies of football. As a wrestling coach, his motto was drill, 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 drill. We practiced for 3.5 hours a day, every 6 days a week. It was grueling. It was tough. And the team was undefeated. He had win streaks of 64 matches and then 88 matches. He'd built a dynasty on the wrestling mats, and he thought he had seen it all. He felt that he was about as good as he was going to get as a wrestling coach. But his love back from when he was a teenager, was to be a football player and a football coach. And I saw your interview with Armand. He is the most singular, competitive individual I've ever met in my life. And he had to figure out football, and he did. And his teams had a lot of success, and primarily because of his defense. He was a very good defensive coach. But Ed, and you'll remember this, our football team was influenced by Jules Yakupovich, who was the Kenmore West coach, invented the radar defense. He would have all 11 defenders standing at the line of scrimmage. They wouldn't commit forward or backwards. They would commit laterally. And but he also two platooned. He had 11 different players on offense, 11 different players on defense, like college and the pros. Most high school teams at that time, you played your best 11 athletes both ways. And Armand, for a couple seasons, tried to do that. And when I was a senior, we had some good athletes on our football team. And we wasted the first probably 3 games of the season trying to two platoon. And unfortunately, most of our best linemen were on offense. And finally, they put them both on offense and defense. And we started to win some games. And, back then, the top team when I played was Lewiston Porter under Coach Pete Rayo. They were ranked first in the state. They were undefeated. And when they came into Wheatfield that year, we had them down 12-0 at the half. And they scored a touchdown in the final minute of the game to beat us 14-12. That was a real heartbreaker. But Armand started to figure out what was what. And so I had a great time with Armand as both a wrestling coach and a football coach.
You talked about Trot. You talked about Newport. You talked about Ken West. How were those days back then, the old Niagara Frontier Football League? Did it bother you that you were playing a big school or you were playing a smaller school, or was it a David versus Goliath mentality, or what was the mindset?
I don't think the players really looked at it that way. You were either good or you weren't. And, if you were, now Newport was smaller than Wheatfield and they had a great team. Kenmore West was really a big school at the time, and they had a lot of players on their squad. But I think we just saw it as who was good and who wasn't good. Trot, unfortunately, did have a numbers problem. They were kind of the sad sack of the NFL back then. Earlier in the 60s, they had a couple good teams. In fact, Roger Haley, who went on to play for Michigan State, was a quarterback for Trot. So Trot had a couple good teams too, but I don't think we looked at it as small versus big back then. I think we just looked at it as like, we've got North Tonawanda. North Tonawanda is always tough. We knew they'd be a tough school to play. Same with Kenmore, either Kenmore West or Kenmore East at the time.
Did you have Terry Harvey as a teammate, or was the field dedicated before your time?
No, that's a NT story for sure. Terry Harvey was 2 years ahead of me. I was on the JV when Terry was injured and unfortunately was paralyzed. And one of the things the school decided to do, Niagara Wheatfield at that time did not have its own football field. We played our games at either LaSalle High School or High Park Stadium, which is now Sal Magley Stadium. So we didn't have a home field. So it was decided, the boosters got together and the school put some money forward, and they created a football field in the back of the high school, and they put up bleachers. The boosters put the bleachers together. They built the press box, and pretty much it was all the manpower of the boosters. And then they wanted to dedicate the field in '71 and name it as Terry Harvey Field. Well, it was the second game of the year. The first game we had tied Niagara Falls High School 6-6. And the second game was against NT. It was our home field, and they had invited Congressman Jack Kemp to be part of the dedication at halftime. And let's just say it didn't turn out to be a day for the Falcons. NT beat us 54-0 that day. I sent you an email. I got into the game in the fourth quarter. So I found the NT Wheatfield 1971 game, and the cameraman had turned the camera off after the third quarter. I mean, NT was up 54-0. Why record the last quarter of the game? But it was a memorable game, but not for a good reason. But Terry was a great guy. He was a good athlete, and unfortunately, one of the very tragic accidents, one of the few that you see in high school sports. But that was Terry Harvey.
When you went to WKBW, did you have a little bias about the Niagara Frontier League and covering those games and getting footage there, or perhaps sending a cameraman to one of those games?
Well, after I got out of college, I went to the University of Dayton, and I was a communications major, and I spent a little bit of time at WLVL Radio in Lockport, and WLVL is where Clip Smith started, and Tom Joles, Rick Azar started there, a number of broadcasters. I got a job working for Niagara Frontier Cable Television in Niagara Falls. It was a local access channel for the cable system up there. And we recorded high school football games. So I did play-by-play on those, and we would rerun the game, that the night of the day the game was played. So I became very familiar with many of the Niagara Frontier League schools. And by the time I got to Channel 7 in 1983, Clip Smith had been there for years. And we had provided Clip with some video highlights from the games that we had produced. So I was very familiar with those teams. And I guess I would say certainly had a bias for the Niagara County schools, try to get their highlights on as much as possible. And I'm proud to say one of the very few sports reporters to give high school wrestling any coverage of its kind on television. I never met another television reporter in the Buffalo market that knew the first thing about wrestling, high school or college. They knew professional wrestling, and I know you're familiar with that, but they didn't know anything about scholastic wrestling. So, I had a little bit of a crusade there to try to get high school wrestling on the map, and we certainly did that in the 80s and then the 90s with Empire Sports.
I'm going to digress to high school wrestling. What's some of your memories with Niagara Wheatfield versus North Tonawanda?
I remember one of the first things Armand Cacciatore told us about the North Tonawanda wrestling team was their big move was the headlock. And we would drill for hours how to get out of a headlock, how to avoid a headlock, and how to get out of a headlock. And I had success against North Tonawanda, although as a JV wrestler, I got put in one of those dreaded headlocks. I almost passed out. Today they probably would have broken it, but back then they let things go a little bit longer. And I remember I got beat by a kid from NT. Now, where I live now, I'm closer to North Tonawanda High School. I live in Wheatfield, but I'm closer to the NT High School than I am to the Niagara Wheatfield High School. But I certainly remember the old junior high, and we would wrestle upstairs in the gym of the junior high. That's where they would have our wrestling match. NT had some very tough kids. They had a kid when I think I was a junior, had taken third in the state. He was a 98 pounder. And I think his name was Jimmy Verastro. And the one thing that impressed us was he had a son. He had a baby boy when he was a senior in high school. And that was intimidating to the rest of us on our team because we thought he was an adult. He was a man. But, luckily we had success against pretty much everybody. Tonawanda was a rival. Ken East was a rival. But Armand had us whipped into shape.
In your opinion, was the Niagara Frontier League the best sports league in upstate New York or all of New York State? And I'm talking about football, wrestling, basketball.
When I was in high school, and I think through the part of the 70s, the Niagara Frontier League was superior over what you would call the ECIC. Very dominant teams at that time, and in football, certainly basketball. Niagara Falls. You talk about small school, large school. Niagara Falls, Trot, and LaSalle were three outstanding basketball programs. All did very well going on to state competition when they brought that into play. So, yeah, I think the Niagara Frontier League at that time was a superior league and had some real powerhouses in most of the sports.
Your boys played football for Niagara Wheatfield in the 2000s. Watching your boys play, did you have all kinds of different memories, flashbacks to when you played?
Certainly. I really loved watching them play football. My son, Rob, played. My son, I have three sons, Rob, Jake, and Daniel. Two of them, Rob and Jake, played football. All three wrestled. All three had success in both sports. Both Rob and Jake were really much better on the defensive side. They were all league. They played in the Lions Club All-Star game. And Jake actually made second team All-State as a defensive end. Now, I'm all of 5'7", Jake's 6'1". He had blonde hair, blue eyes. I used to introduce Jake as my son, and I would get a look like, your son? Yeah, I said, no, he took after my dad's side, the Polish side of the family. But it was great watching them play football. In fact, I think when Jake was a senior, 2006, may have been the last time Wheatfield beat North Tonawanda in football. They beat him at NT. And Jake had a really outstanding game that day. But watching them wrestle was tough. That was tough. I often said it was worse watching my sons wrestle than when I wrestled, because you spent the whole day anxious about your match that night, regardless of who your competition was. Wrestling is a very tough sport psychologically because it's just you and your opponent out on the mat. You're not on a football field with 21 other people running around, or a baseball diamond or basketball court. It's just you and your opponent and the referee. So your anxiety level is at an all-time high. But you can step out on the mat, and seconds after the match starts, the anxiety's gone. You're just worried about the match. When you're watching your son wrestle, or now your daughter wrestle, because there's women's wrestling, it's really tough. I mean, if the match is in question, you're biting your lip to the very end. And again, Rob and Jake had a lot of success in wrestling. Jake took second in New York State twice. So that was an experience. And yeah, did I have memories? Absolutely. My wife still kids me today because I can still recall certainly my wrestling matches from back in the day. And most of my old teammates can too. Now, do the memories tend to grow over the years? Absolutely. I always say you become, the older you get, the better you were. But it was a great time. A lot of men, period, the highlight of their life is their high school athletic career. And I think that's so reminiscent of, sports like football and certainly wrestling. They just leave an imprint on your life forever.
During your sports days at Empire Sports Network and at WKBW, you saw a lot of different high school rivalries in the area. Tonawanda, North Tonawanda, Kenmore East, Kenmore West, West Seneca and Lancaster. If you could rank these rivalries, how would you rank them from top to bottom?
Well, I'm probably most familiar with the Tonawanda, North Tonawanda rivalry. I know that was always a big game. I've had the fortune to speak the Kiwanis of Tonawanda hold a luncheon before the Tonawanda NT game. And I had the opportunity to be a guest speaker for that and talk to those young men. Now, in many of these rivalries, Ed, and this, the size of the schools have changed over the years. So they still have the rivalry game, but like in North Tonawanda, Tonawanda's situation, NT has dominated that series because it's such a bigger school. They have so many more athletes to put out on the field or choose from. I think the same has happened for like Lancaster, Depew, and West and East. West Seneca West Seneca, those types of games. But they're always, the rivalries have gotten diluted a bit because now with the playoffs, that is usually your last game of your regular season. But if you've already qualified for the playoffs, coaches have, and if you're in the playoffs, coach has a little bit of a dilemma as to how long do you play the starters and whatnot, knowing that you have a chance to play for a sectional title, possibly even advance in the state tournament after that game. So it's different than back in my day when that was it. If you won that game at the end of the year, our big rivalry, as I said, was Lewiston Porter. That was the closest school to us geographically. We were both rural schools, and it meant a lot to beat Newport. But I think for like North Tonawanda and Tonawanda, where you literally, you have a canal to separate the two communities. And it was a very fierce rivalry, and I think almost always the last game of the year.
It was, and they played some of those games into November, which they don't do anymore. They leave that for sectional play at that point. We've talked about a few things so far, Bob. What would you like to talk about that I haven't brought up so far?
When you gave me the opportunity, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the lack of coverage for high school sports in Western New York in this day and age. You told me you worked for the Tonawanda News and some of those publications. And, back in my day, the Tonawanda News, the Niagara Gazette, the Lockport Sun and Journal, those were the papers that really promoted and glorified high school athletics. I know that when Niagara Wheatfield would wrestle Tonawanda, the best write-up we would get all year would be in the Tonawanda News, complete with photos and what have you. Today, television sports does very, very little with high school sports. The Buffalo News is almost all but forgotten about high school sports. They don't see any money in it. And to a certain extent, having been in the business, I understand that because if you go to high school sports, events in the area, many venues have maybe mom and dad in the stands. Many high schools, the students don't support the teams any longer. There are some exceptions, but overall, now I'll say back at Niagara Wheatfield, back in the day when we'd have a wrestling match, the gym was full, and there was a lot of fans there for the JV match, which would start at 5:30. But I think that times have changed. I think high school athletes, the numbers aren't what they used to be. Kids have a lot of many other activities. Everybody's driving a vehicle. I don't know about you, but when I was in high school, mom and dad drove me everywhere. We didn't have a chance to drive the car, and there was one car in our family. So things are different. There's different interests. When I was at Empire Sports on Friday nights, now the Empire Sports Network went from Buffalo east to Albany, south to Binghamton, actually overlapped into Pennsylvania, and then we went west as far as Cleveland in our heyday. And we started a Friday night show called High School Highlights, and we had digital satellite trucks, and we would get highlights for football as far east as Albany and Binghamton. Not every week. We'd wait for a big game, which would make it worthwhile to send a truck that far out. But we had the bankroll and we had the interest. We were a cable sports network. We didn't have to worry about advertising. We made every month we were paid a subscriber fee. So it gave us an advantage over the over-air broadcasters. And so every Friday night we'd give highlights from across the state. And, with the demise, unfortunately, of the Empire Sports Network in 2005, which was wrapped into the Adelphia Communications scandal, I guess you would call it. And Adelphia was eventually bought by Time Warner. Well, they got rid of Empire Sports. They got rid of WNSA FM, which was an all sports radio station. We did a lot of high school coverage on WNSA FM. In fact, one of the things we would do on a Friday night is we would create we would take popular songs, mostly classic rock, and we would take dialogue from some of the famous sports movies and we would mix it with the music. And we would try to build an atmosphere on Friday night, kind of a sports high school atmosphere. And then we would encourage, parents and kids to call in with the scores from their various games. So we had a lot of fun with that. But there's nothing like that today. The all sports radio station, Buffalo WGR, does nothing with high school sports at all. You can't get a high school score on radio and very few on television any longer. You have to look at basically websites and social media that were created by boosters of the teams. That's a shame to me.
Do you think that's driven because it's a business decision, or they don't want to employ more people?
It's absolutely a business decision. When the stations were all taken over by conglomerates who own stations across the country, they put their money where they put the resources where there's the biggest payback. Buffalo, when I worked at Channel 7, I left in 1991. I always laugh when people say, "Oh, I remember you from Channel 7." I said, "You got to be in your 60s," because I've been gone for 32 years from Channel 7. But Buffalo was number 35, the number 35 market in the country. Yeah. Now it's 53. That's a huge drop. That's a huge drop in revenue. People ask why. Well, the fewer amount of viewers, because the fewer amount of people who live in your community, you can't charge as much for advertising, so you don't make as much. You don't make as much for advertising. That's the sole revenue stream for broadcast television or radio. So they have less money to spend. And when you have an investment firm that buys your station, say, they're looking for the biggest payback in their investment. So you can't go to them and say, "Well, we really should be covering these high school sports on Friday night." And they'll say, "Well, what's our payback? I mean, well, how much will it affect the ratings, or how much can we sell in advertising?" And then it becomes the chicken and the egg, because if you don't have attendance, TV and radio stations and newspapers pay attention. If they don't see people in the stands, then they ask, why should we devote resources to cover this event if nobody's interested? But I also think that the interest wanes when you don't have the coverage. I think there are alumni from many of these schools where if they read a newspaper article or saw a television or heard a radio report touting a big game coming up Friday night, I think there are people that would go out to watch the game. It would pique their interest. And without that, most times there you can't even find a schedule in a newspaper any longer when the local teams are playing and who they're playing against. And if you're an alumni and you're of age, maybe you're not as prone to go on the internet and search for that type of thing. So, unfortunately, but Ed, I think if you've been around the state, you go in Pennsylvania, you go in Ohio, there's a much greater interest in high school sports than there is in New York State. And Western New York is really on the low side of that now. I find Rochester to have a much bigger interest in high school sports, and they have, for the most part, across the board, Section 5 right now kind of dominates Section 6 when it comes to most of the general sports. They seem to have more interest in it. Now, maybe that's because Rochester doesn't have the professional sports teams that Buffalo has, like the Bills and the Sabres. So a lot of people devote their time to rooting for those teams, especially the Bills. I think that's a part of what we experience here.
You brought up some good points regarding high school sports. What else sticks in your craw about high school sports as it is today?
New York State, sometimes its own worst enemy. They've reduced the number of games. I remember back in the around 2008, 2009, there was somewhat of a budget crunch. High schools actually, the New York State Public High School Athletic Association volunteered unasked to reduce the number of events. Now, Ed, what does it cost to have say an 8th football game? You're paying the referees, maybe security. Most of the people that work for the school are there at a small stipend. You're not saving much money. It was this political move to make it look as though they were concerned about the state. So who suffers? It's the student athletes. I know many college coaches talk about, many don't bother to recruit New York State because they just don't play the number of games. They don't play the type of competition you see elsewhere. Again, Pennsylvania and Ohio. You'd think these two states that border New York State would have some of an influence. I see some of it in the southern tier of Section 6. Between the football, basketball, wrestling teams, there is a spillover from the interest in Pennsylvania. But you get up to Niagara County, you go to a high school football game. My buddy and I would loved going right after our sons, graduated around 2006, 2007. Friday nights, we'd go to North Tonawanda High School to watch the Friday night football game. It didn't matter who was playing. It was just a great atmosphere. You're under the lights. You had a good crowd. You grab a hot dog. And but there's not a lot of schools that were like NT that had that type of tradition.
What's your thoughts about artificial turf versus going back to the old grass fields and the old stadiums?
Well, Niagara Wheatfield just got a brand new facility. It's just gorgeous. And it's the artificial turf with the rubber particles interwoven amongst the grass. It's beautiful. I mean, I would have loved to have played on that. Now, the initial artificial turf, and I remember from my days covering the Buffalo Bills, walking on the turf at Denridge Stadium, it was literally concrete with a carpet on it. It was hard as a rock. Grass fields, I think it's the best for for safety and things of that nature. But there's a maintenance, fee. I know that Niagara Wheatfield's grass field was not always properly, let's just say, maintained. If there was a mud hole created on the second game of the season, pretty sure by the 8th game of the season, that was a deeper hole than it was in the beginning of the season. Nobody was bothering to go out there, fill it in with dirt and put some grass seed on it. That's not how it was back in my day. But I think the artificial turf, it's pretty much, you're a minority school if you don't have an artificial field now.
Do you buy the notion that today's athletes are better, faster, stronger than the guys from back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s?
In general, yes. I think the athletes who are great athletes, say in the 50s and 60s, given the same atmosphere and the level of they would rise to the competition. Now, the human race is getting larger in a lot of ways. I'm a lot larger than I was in high school, and I'm not talking about my height. But I know that my sons, the training they went through, the weight training, things that I would emphasize with them that, my mom and dad never talked to me about lifting weights or what I ate or any of that nature. It wasn't part of the deal. Now we know so much more. Sports science has become so, regimented where specifically you get an injury. My one son's a doctor of physical therapy. I mean, he treats athletes all the time. Ed, in our day, if a kid went down in high school with a knee injury, that was pretty much going to either end his career or affect the rest of his career. The surgery, I had a cousin who was an outstanding wrestler. He tore up his knee, tore up some ligaments. He had knee surgery. He went on to wrestle the year later, never the same though. The surgery back then never brought you back to 100%. Today, athletes go down with a knee injury or a shoulder injury. There's corrective surgery that's going to, with the proper rehab, you're going to be as good, if not better than you were beforehand. So I think modern science and modern medicine has changed the way that the human body responds to injury. And as a result, I think on a general basis, the athletes are better. Now, are they as dedicated? Do they play 3 sports? Many of them don't. Again, and I hate to keep saying back in our day, but if you're a good football player, you're probably out for the basketball team or the wrestling team, maybe the swim team. You were definitely out for your baseball or track. That's what you did. You wanted to have an activity to do after school. Few were the kids who were so good in one sport that was the only thing they did.
Were there a lot of sports camps, football camps, basketball camps, baseball camps? It seems like there's a lot of camps every summer for kids to choose from or be specific with a particular sport.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Armand Cacciatore was really big with the Jerry Butler football camp, and Jerry Butler was there every day as well as a couple other the Buffalo Bills. Of course, Jim Kelly has had probably the best known football camp in our area, although it's not really a serious camp. It's more for the younger kids and give them a chance to meet some of the Bills and be out at the stadium. But you get into some of these camps where you have college coaches as instructors. A lot of kids get a chance get recruited that way because some of these assistant college coaches who work these camps see the kids, especially in basketball. They see the kid in camp for a week, and now suddenly that young man's on their radar where maybe beforehand they might not have been.
Bob, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. We're running out of time right now. Wow, time has flown. It's been a pleasure to meet you, to listen to what you have to say and your thoughts regarding high school football back in the old Niagara Frontier League. I wish you well. Thank you so much, and God bless.
Ed, thanks so much. Kudos to the North Tonawanda Hall of Fame YouTube channel. It's the best I've seen, so thank you so much.